you said earlier that the good is something that transmutes, let's say, and recedes. And, right,
That does what?
Transmutes and recedes, the good. It moves around. It's a moving target.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Okay. So let me ask you what you think about this. It's like a summum bonum explanation for the relationship between the concept of God and that concept. So imagine that something calls to you in the manner we just described. I'm not going to hypothesize a God in the way that you objected to. Okay, but you know in your life that there's a sequence of things that call to you. Okay, so now imagine that there's a commonality behind that sequence, that all those things that call to you are pointing you in a direction. And the direction I would suggest that they're pointing you in is the direction that unifies that emotional and motivational conflict. You see what I... Okay. So that seems to be an okay explanation as well. Because this is actually how the God of the Old Testament is characterized, right? Is that he is the commonality of callings. And there's another element too that emerges because it's important. You could think about calling as the manifestation of the positive emotions that pull us forward. That's a reasonable way of thinking about it. But the God in the Old Testament is also characterized as conscience, right? And conscience also has that kind of autonomy, right? Because you call yourself out on your misbehavior. And it's something that in some sense is inescapable. Okay, so the dynamism between calling and conscience is one of the most profound ways that the God of the Old Testament is characterized in the biblical corpus. And it looks to me like it's an attempt to characterize the orienting function of what attracts your attention and what also keeps you on the pathway. Is something like that. So is there any of that you would object to? Like
No, I think you're making a fairly easy topic more difficult than it has to be, but it's an interesting way of doing it, and I am happy to grant you that interpretation of it's a way of reading the Old Testament where it makes a little more sense than if it was taken literally. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to go at this from the same issue from a slightly different perspective, because I want to zero in on this issue of relationship, because I think that's the most fundamental stumbling block that would be useful for us to discuss. And I think it's the strangest element of the religious endeavor. We've established a certain amount of common ground in relationship to the idea of a hierarchy of value or a hierarchy of good. So I'm just going to leave that sit for a minute, but I want to investigate the relationship issue because it is key to, as you point out in your book, it is key to what people generally understand, at least as part of the religious enterprise. And it's also the insistence that's probably most susceptible to the objections that you've put forth, for example, with regards to the hyperactive agency detector. And so I've been very curious about why the relationship with what's good is conceptualized so often as a relationship, right? As an actual relationship. Okay, so let me walk through something and you tell me what you think about this. So I've been conceptualizing thought as secularized prayer. And the reason I'm doing that, I suppose to some degree, is anthropological, because I think that prayer preceded thought developmentally. I think that's what the historical evidence would suggest. We haven't been thinking rationally for very long. It's perhaps several thousand years. We've been thinking religiously for much longer than that. And I'm not trying to establish a qualitative primacy here. I'm trying to account for the facts. So I'm going to outline what I think we do when we think, and I'd like you to tell me what you think about the outline.
Okay.
So the first thing I would say is that thoughts orient us in a manner that's akin to our perceptions and our emotions. So they're of the same enterprise. We use thoughts to move us towards our goals, and than to transform our goals.
Yeah.
We do.
Yeah.
It's the abstract. Okay, good. So, and then I would say that thoughts make themselves manifest in relationship to our aim, right? Just like our perceptions do. And so our thoughts are defined, at least in part, by our aim. So this is what I think I do when I think. So the first thing I do when I think is admit that I don't know something. So I come to the process in humility and I admit I have a problem. It's like, here's something I don't understand. It could be something I'm curious about. It could be something that's bothering me, but I have a problem. And I also admit that I have the problem, and I presume that there's an answer, and I presume that if I get the answer, that would be good. And then I would say I do something that you could describe. I allow myself to receive a thought. It's something like that. Now, I could say I think, or I could say I think something up, but I don't really like that formulation because I don't think it's a good description of actually what happens. What happens is that I posit a problem and answers appear to me.
That's good. I'm happy with that. It reminds me of Plato in the Theaetetus, where he says knowledge is like the birds in a giant aviary. And you've got all these birds. The trick is, can you get them to come when you call? And so you've got all this knowledge that you've acquired, and the hard part is getting it to come when it's needed. And how often do we smite our forehead and say, "Oh, I knew that all along. Why didn't I think of it?" That's when we find that there was something we knew that didn't get used by us at the appropriate moment. And the best way to make the new thoughts occur to you is to be in a discussion like we're in right now. It's to get another mind to help you, and we stimulate each other's minds and dredge up new corners of the other person's minds, which may have interesting ways of putting things that we hadn't quite thought of before. Then, oh, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I get that. That's Descartes' big error was in being solitary, trusting to his own mind and trying to get his clear and distinct ideas ever clearer and more distinct. And the only way he could trust them, he thought, is if he posited a benevolent, all-knowing God. We don't need that. What we need is each other.
So, okay, so let me riff on that for a minute. So there's a gospel insistence that where two or more are gathered in the name of the Logos, that Spirit makes itself manifest. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so imagine that what we're trying to do in this conversation, and what we hopefully are doing to some degree, is to stumble forward somewhat less blindly toward the truth. Okay, so that's dependent on our aim. And if our aim is at the truth, then the Spirit that makes that journey possible, that would be the religious formulation. The Spirit that makes that journey possible will make itself manifest in the space defined by our interaction.
It would seem to me that would be a good definition of science, too.
I would agree with that, but
we can leave the religion right out of it and say it is the organization of science where trust is assumed but tested, where people of different opinions come together and sort things out constructively. And that's the best test of all of truth.
You said, for example, that they come together in trust.
Yes.
So that I would say that there's a precondition for the scientific inquiry to occur even at the level of dialogue.
Yes.
And the precondition is that we can trust. What are we trusting, do you think? Are we trusting? The good in that situation? What is it that allows for trust?
It's the goodwill that we normally assume in a civilized world. When you and I walk down the street, we assume that the people that we see are all around us, most of whom are total strangers to us, we assume that they don't mean us any harm.
Okay.
I like the way Paul Seabright has put this in his book, The Company of Strangers. If you put a whole lot of unrelated chimpanzees in a large room together, they would be terrified. They would be screaming, and they would be unable to sit there calmly. And I sometimes point this out when I'm in a large auditorium and there's hundreds of people, none of them related. I said, is anybody here scared to death? No, we're not. We trust each other. That human trust is the key to civilization and to science, and it's under attack right now with artificial intelligence and misrepresentation. And the technologies of misrepresentation, which are eroding trust in a very...
I use the same example, by the way, when I'm talking to large audiences, and the chimpanzee example as well. And so you said that the trust that makes even a scientific conversation possible is the trust in mutual goodwill, right? Okay, so, all right. So I want to relate that idea of goodwill back to something that we talked about earlier. So I think that if the battle between emotional and motivational systems occurs optimally, it produces a unity of spirit that makes that trust possible. That's what you do when you socialize a child. Like, children are really socialized between the age of 2 and 4, right? They're pretty egocentric and temporally bounded at the age of 2. They kind of want whatever their motivational system wants right now, and to hell with the consequences. That's the definition of a 2-year-old. And there's some wonderful things about that. And then as they mature and as their cortex matures, those systems integrate. And if that integration takes place, then you have the presence of a overarching structure that enables that trust to be made manifest. A child will learn to take turns, for example.
That's why I say that free will is an achievement, not a metaphysical endowment. You have to develop free will. And the reason why we don't hold children responsible for misdeeds is they haven't developed the self-control. They haven't developed the sort of trustworthy, reliable autonomy that we demand of each other. The price we pay in self-control is a price. It's the best bargain on the planet. It means that we can walk around without fearing